Hello, today is Tuesday, July 2nd, 2019. This is the conformance subproject of SIG Architecture's standard office hours. We have a pretty sparse agenda. I will share my screen right now. So the only agenda item I had listed here was to discuss John's proposal. Before I get into that, we met a couple of weeks ago, right after the last session. We had a grooming session where we went through the backlog and we did a lot of refinement. And I did another pass recently of things that overlapped with this and cleared out a bunch of those items. The reason why I wanted to discuss John's proposal is because we had originally said that this was the P0 for this cycle. I don't know if other folks have had a chance to review that document.
I have. I don't seem to have the capacity of imagination to understand logistically how it's going to work. I'm kind of hoping maybe some time away from the computer will help me imagine the logistics better. But like my only interest in this is hopefully the use of more structured metadata as represented by YAML will allow us to break up this process. Because right now, like the same person, we have to simultaneously decide whether or not this is a behavior that should be conformant, and then also whether or not the test as written exercises this behavior with the appropriate hygiene we expect of conformance tests. And we want to split those up. But I don't entirely understand how this will, the mechanics of how this will help us split that up. Like I can see that, okay, great, we'll have a YAML file that enumerates a bunch of behaviors, and we can off over here go through the churn of like getting the right people to identify if those are the right behaviors. I'm still having difficulty sort of tying the tooling together to make sure that we still have like a good gate in place to ensure or enforce that when a given test, you know, like the behaviors are maybe being tagged by IDs. If we say that that test has that behavior's ID, like do we know that it's really exercising that? You know, how can we ensure that like the appropriate set of conformance reviewers have made sure that this works as expected? I think of it in the same way where like we kind of have API changes kind of need to go off to a special set of people, even though those changes could live sort of anywhere in our code base. I'm trying to imagine how we would do something similar for conformance tests. You know, one thought is we suggest that people move their tests out of sort of the SIG-owned packages over to like a conformance-owned directory, and we gate approval that way, but that it just doesn't feel right off the top of my head. As to the contents of like auto-generating stuff with a bunch of fields, I still remain skeptical. I don't really have the full corpus of our conformance tests paged into my brain. I think in an ideal world, being able to throw a file at a cluster and then wait a bit and then see behaviors afterwards sounds great. I don't know if that's really how the majority of our conformance tests work right now. Maybe John has done a better survey of all of this than I have. So I'm kind of interested in how, like, I want to see us try that. I would love for my skepticism to be proven wrong, and I just want to understand how to sort of tie the corpus of tests that we have back to this sort of YAML metadata.
So
a lot. So
there's a piece that's missing for me that I wanted. So we have a bunch of stuff inside of API machinery inside of our types.go, right? Whatever they are for across the different types, right? And what I envisioned was some type of annotation well-formed annotation that then, as you do some type of generate, whatever that may be, right, then it would actually go through and create some set of output artifacts where this could be 1 through n, where one of them could be the that behavior .yaml. But what I'm missing inside the proposal is basically all of this stuff here, right? And then how we go from here, this behavior.yaml, into a set of changes inside of the tests themselves. So like this is a comment I made on the doc, and his comment was regarding the metadata, we could get pretty far without it. And I'm like, isn't the purpose of this to be automation for us to be able to do that? And so I was I don't quite know the answer to this, and hopefully we can send John the recording and he can help illuminate in the proposal what's missing.
That's where I feel like you and I are coming from slightly different, but ideally complementary perspectives. Like I want to get us to a point where we're using structured metadata so that either we have automation generate a bunch of that YAML, and we look at that and see like, oh yeah, that looks pretty sane. Or we lock a bunch of humans in a room and shake them until YAML comes out of their brains. And then we sort of understand that, oh yeah, that's sort of a good corpus of behaviors that we should write tests to. Either way, like we have this pile of YAML. I then want to understand the logistics of tying all of our, what tests do we need to write to satisfy these behaviors, that sort of thing. I feel like maybe you're approaching it from, ideally we could generate like all of these things end to end, which that's where my skepticism is, but that's why I want to figure out how we can iterate to that first step of like, given the metadata, can we tie the things back?
Well, I'd want to start with like getting an initial cut of what this is supposed to look like in the types. So then we can see what the output artifacts are and how we can map that. Because right now that's the piece that's totally missing for me. And we could implement a portion of his through just basically we wouldn't have this thing, right? He's got a portion which basically says how the tests get mocked. So this thing here would be like mocking the tests with tags. So for me, this part here is the most important piece. And then, once we have this, anybody could do this piece, right?
I have a question too, and sorry if this was answered in the minute or two I was late, but there were kind of two sets of tests. There were the kind that were just like the CRUD-based API stuff, which seems like you just consume the existing API to say all mutable fields can be edited. But then there was the extra layer, which was he just sort of, I thought, hand-waved and said, there will be more complex things and we'll maybe have to do those manually. And I didn't know how any of what was discussed in the paper helps with those complex ones.
Yeah, it doesn't help that he's out today. This is like the most important thing on our list, and we're talking in absentia.
But so like here's an example that I was having trouble grappling with, like how it would fit into this framework. Right now, we have some conformance tests that sort of validate intrapod communication, right? So like pods should be able to talk to other pods, or nodes should be able to talk to pods, stuff like that. Like, what's the API-driven way of expressing that desired behavior?
I think you'd have to, somewhere in the pod API, you'd have to like enumerate the list of behaviors that you'd expect, right? Like either within the APIs themselves, you'd have to say, these are the guarantees of the behaviors and annotate that inside of the types.go file for whatever APIs they are, right? These are the behavioral expectations of the APIs.
Well, but like
somebody would have
behaviors are like extra API, right? It's not just from the API we guarantee this, but it's like if you are in a pod, then this will be the case. But you have to first like get into the pod. Is that kind of what your statement was about, Aaron?
I think so. It's just like, it's not clear to me how I would define that pods should be able to talk to other pods and nodes should be able to talk to pods if I start with API fields as my basis. Like I feel like there will need to necessarily be room in this to allow for humans to just write a behavior that is like a story, like a pod should be able to talk to another pod. And maybe I can like reverse engineer it and say like, if I create a pod with this spec, and then I also apply a resource that sort of tries to create another pod, and then in my check section, like I make sure that somehow they're able to talk to each other. Maybe, like I said, that's where I feel like my imagination is not allowing me to sort of walk this through step by step today.
So the way he mocks the test would allow you for anybody to write a test that has this behavioral characteristics, but it wouldn't be feed forward. So I think that's what he means by his, like, you can get pretty far today just by mocking the existing tests. And you might be able to go backwards from here back to that generated YAML too as well, if you have the specified mock, right? Because he's basically adding tags in a specific way to the tests that allow you to say, this is the behavior and this is the expectation, without you having to change what the current testing structure is by using tags. So he's basically adding more tags to an already tag overloaded environment, which
is this discussed in the
I don't know if I understand what you're saying there, though. Like, could you, how does adding tags change behavior or something?
it doesn't change behavior. It's basically a way for you to, you said, how can I insert a human into this? And the answer is a human would write the tags in the well-defined way.
Okay. I also really desperately want us to avoid tags if at all possible. Like no more tags. Like literally just change the test name itself to be, if it has to be like that machine parsable ID.
But that's a big part of his proposal, right? Like if I share my screen again and I go back, share, too many windows.
I didn't see it in a large part of the proposal. I just saw it in the portion called coverage tooling, which talked about how would we tie back or signify that, like today, as written with using all of the Ginkgo stuff that we use, when we say conformance.it, like how would we know that that conformance.it line implements this behavior with ID whatever. And he was like, let's just slap another tag with the ID on it. And like,
yeah, that's pretty much what it was. I think he actually took out the whole text section. He did in this iteration. The text section that basically identified the output that looked like a modified version of the existing tests.
Okay. And I want us to stop leaning on tags to the point where, like, if we have to rename the test, because apparently, like, nobody here actually cares or bothers with the fact that, as written by Ginkgo, this is supposed to be like a human readable description, right? We describe the thing, and then we sort of say the different behaviors that it should do. And so, like, we could change just the text of the it entirely to correspond to one of those IDs or something. But I think, like, attempting to shove more metadata into tags is just, that is bending this past the point of breaking. And that's just because, like, tags are generally used to sort of categorize a whole bunch of things across a disparate set of tests, whereas here, I think a behavior is going to be exercised by exactly one test. It'll just be a one-to-one mapping. And I don't want to create a couple hundred tags all over the place. Does that make sense?
It does, but that's a deeper change. I think the reason why he wanted to do this change is that it works easily with what we currently already have.
Like another, so this is what we have. I know you and I both maybe don't like it, but, you know, we have this thing that sort of walks the abstract syntax tree of all of our test files and ensures that if something is written as a conformance test and it has the conformance at line, it also enforces that it's got to have a comment above that with some specific fields. And those fields have to be a release, test name, and description. And so test name could be our stand-in for, like, the behavior ID or whatever. This was all ostensibly used so that we could, like, generate docs of all of the conformance things. And again, I feel like that should probably just tie right back to these behaviors. So we could do it via, replacing text and comments, and our code sort of already supports that today. Is just leaning harder on the abstract syntax tree. And I also could maybe imagine or understand how when we're trying to when we want to verify like this test as run in the wild actually exercises this behavior. Right now, like the test name is kind of the biggest thing that sort of ties through all that.
Hippie, did you want to say something?
It's basically around the wrapping of the functions, using things like conformance it and extending it in the ways that Aaron was mentioning. There are some other ones, but he captured the major point.
If you did this last piece, if instead of being mock tags, it just wrapped conformance it, would that make it more acceptable from what he currently has?
Sure.
The piece that bothers me the most is the lack of this. Go ahead, Hippie.
In addition to where we're talking about using the DSL that we currently have around describe and then context and it, we tend to put all of our test structure in the same place as that as those nested description and tagging information, rather than having a place where there's test functions that we utilize within those descriptions. And when we're talking about generating, it's generating the test scaffolding in a way where people can easily pick up, and based on the test description, the behavior, we'll have an automated set of please fill in the blanks here. I think we maybe should look at, as we move forward, decoupling the structure of the describe and the conformance it from the implementation of the test, if that makes sense. Even just sticking in the functions that need to be called in those areas, because it's that missing piece between taking your types.go and generating a scaffolding that maps back to that behavior definition that you pulled out, because it's the tooling that we need.
All right, so if I were to take a step back and try to summarize the feedback so far in some actionable way, which this will be a total stab at it. Like, my particular thing that I don't like is I really want a way to specify the auto generation in the with metadata from the types.go.
And are you saying on all the tests or just on like the CRUD tests?
I want to be able to annotate and just to have the generation do its business. Right now, the generation could be simple scaffolding that you could rip apart to do whatever you want to, but the generation would then generate a behavior.yaml file plus some other tooling to wrap around whatever conformance it is with some actual structure that's not using tags. Right? Then from there, some of the scaffolding could be auto-generated, but we didn't have to use it. We could it could be stubs that we could use to fill in the details of what we needed to do to create it, wrapping this conformance it behavior. Is that like actionable feedback that actually makes any sense to people?
Yes, I think that makes sense. And maybe I'm just sounding like a broken record. Like, it sounds like you're really interested in the automation piece that auto-generates as much of the behavior files and then tests that are driven by those behavior files as possible. Whereas I'm interested in just sort of figuring out what the format of those behavior files should be and where they live, so that I can start to get to the business of tying our existing corpus of tests to those behavior files, thinking that these problems can sort of be solved in parallel. If we can agree on on like the written format of this stuff and how to tie back to it, then like we can have people going off and, brainstorming a bunch of behaviors and manually creating those files, or we can figure out how to automatically get the right annotations in the places and generate all of those files. But it's that decoupling that I'm interested in again, right? The decoupling of, is this the right list of behaviors versus are these tests written the right way? And I view this as really moving us toward that if we can. I just haven't quite figured out the mechanics, and hopefully I'll be able to brainstorm it and dump it on the PR of how like we could use the YAML file to like get a pass of highly bottlenecked people to agree that like, yeah, these are behaviors that we want and they're all sort of like TBD. And then we can go off and have people identify tests that hit those TBDs. Am I
Sounds
talking
like
at odds with you, Tim, or do you agree that this is like complementary behavior?
I think they're two separate things that are complementary.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ippy.
It might be useful, Tim, since you are familiar with the API machinery, to at least document, if not give a few examples of what we have available generating from our types.go into as much information that is there, just so we can see how the things can map. In the same way, approaching it from our AST walker for the existing test, see how much data we can pull out of that. In addition to what type of auto generation tools and conformance tools are there, because this is the center point, is tying those three things together. Actually, it's the go ahead.
I'd defer. I mean, I know Clayton's quiet, but I'd defer to Clayton more so than
Okay.
the API machinery folks and how they do auto generation from the types.go.
Okay. I will go ahead.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
You know, I feel like a lot of our generation approaches require a pretty significant commitment of time up front, the maintenance down the road. So just don't underestimate it. It's not intractable for sure. And it has advantages when you're trying to enforce things that we could all talk about in text, but are hard to do any other way.
Like, maybe help me understand. I have this skepticism where I've looked at things in the past that attempt to like look at an open API spec and then try and auto-generate a bunch of CRUD tests or something based on that spec, so that we can verify, like, are we sort of, fuzzing all the appropriate fields at all the appropriate values? But it's kind of unclear to me what sort of annotations we could use to sort of help us understand or describe, like, the intended effect or behaviors that certain fields would have, such that we can generate tests against it. I don't know what. Because, yeah, so the CRUD against sort of the validity of the data didn't seem like it was going to be of that much value for this group, because we are sort of more interested in the behaviors. So I'm kind of, and maybe Tim, you have some ideas too, like how are we supposed to annotate these fields so we know what they do?
That was the missing piece for me. I didn't know the answer. So like that was the one that I asked it on the KEP, and I think that's the one that's the blocker for me. Is like, how do I annotate the existing API types so that I can actually auto-generate the data that I want in a meaningful way? Because without auto-generation, without actually wrapping some portions of the API, it's just somebody needs to go through with a fine-tooth comb and just do all this work. You're either going to auto-generate good portions of it and have it make sure to be like somewhat automated. Otherwise, you're going to have a person scrawling up papyrus what the rules of the system are, right?
Yes, and I'm trying to advocate that I think this approach allows both of those to happen in parallel, whereas the system we have in place does not. And that's why I want us to sort of try and land the specification and the tying of the stuff together so that we could take a crack at auto-generating the stuff, and also we could go get the papyrus out and the fine-toothed combs and have a working session with the right people or something.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about this, I think that makes sense to me, Aaron, in the sense that, like you said, the CRUD tests for this group don't maybe matter that much because nothing is getting to the conformance level with like the basic CRUD functionality not working. So how do you explain the more complex things? And in the document, he just says you'd have a series of manifests and a series of conditions. And my question there was, like, that just sounds like a human written test. And even a subset of our tests. It's just a very simple set something up, test something else. Whereas we have a lot more complex things with like tearing down the API server and then checking something or then reinstating it. Like it's multiple steps. Sometimes are actions, sometimes are tests, sometimes are API driven, sometimes are environment driven. And I would worry that like we're going to effectively kind of move the burden from we're not writing these tests, but we're effectively writing all those functions and then aliasing those in some sort of YAML document. And it's just sort of a work, it's still the same thing. It's still, we're left with now this YAML document. How do we ensure coverage? How do we ensure it's doing what we want? So on and so forth. I felt like we were just kind of shifting where we were confused. But I do agree that the idea of having a separate document of these are the behaviors is just useful in its own right. And it sounds like that's what you're saying, Aaron, that you would find useful decoupling that from the tests.
Yeah, for me, this is about sort of enumerating, to borrow some of Tim's language, it's like enumerating the state space, or like, let's figure out what the definition of done is and try and write that down. And like what we've been doing thus far is as a proxy, right, saying that API coverage at a very chunky level of just path and verb is one sort of map of the territory. And then we could make that map more granular by sort of figuring out like what are the different fields that we're setting in all of these tests to figure out how much of that we're covering. But like the actual territory itself is all of the behaviors.
Yeah, so what I'm looking for is more of a spec of how you define behaviors. Like you see how the Ginkgo itself is a behavior-driven testing infrastructure. And if we can map a way to declaratively define behaviors, which, what the expectations are for end state, right? Like you define what is the behavior I'm expecting and what's the end goal or the end state that I'm trying to achieve in some standard fashion, then we can actually auto-generate pieces of it, and with the notion that like some of it will not requires human intervention, right?
Yeah. One of the things that I was exploring is how different behavior-driven development libraries do separate these concerns in a precise and manner. And a couple of the other ones I saw were based on Gherkin, which comes from the Cucumber and that spec world. And one of the things that seems to apply well, the directory structure and the format actually matches the area suites and suite that is defined in the KEP currently. And what I really dig is that you can have these files defining, given these steps, and it's step, 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 step. When we have these step, then there's an expectation at the end. And there's no code in that. And it can still be auto-generated. It's still a file format, right? But then we can reuse the sections over and over again. The test code gets where we can reuse it much simpler and completely separate the definition of done and the behavior definition into files that are actually part of the test. So the definition of done is part of the Go test run. It just matches those definitions to code based on regex expressions. It'd be worth exploring because it does provide a lot of the code generation. Because I think one of our objectives here were, let's get some test scaffolding. Let's make sure that we can generate and validate the behaviors and have some stuff to say if our conformance test behavior coverage has increased. That's our end goal. And at least some exploration into existing frameworks that really target that well might be worth some time.
I wouldn't disagree with that statement. When we originally chose Ginkgo, it's not because we thought it was great. It was because it was early days in Go, and behavioral-driven testing in Go didn't exist. And a lot of the people came from the Ruby Cucumber land, where it's much more well-defined. I did a quick Google search. I just pasted it in chat that somebody's created a library around this. It might be useful before we go too far in the spec to enumerate what state space for declare or what state space exists for doing behavioral driven auto-generated suites exists nowadays.
And Hippie's comment on John's KEP enumerates that and a bunch of articles that describe how to use that library, as well as 2 other libraries in addition to Ginkgo. Because that was going to be my other comment. I'm not super well steeped in the universe or in the land of behavior-driven development, but it could be that we're trying to reinvent a wheel here, and it would be worth exploring.
Maybe somebody who's more versed, can you explain like all these things with keywords? And I've looked at Cucumber, and I've used something called the robot framework, and they try to say that they're simplifying things by, like, in their expression, decoupling the code from the behaviors, but it effectively just becomes a proxy, and I don't think you get any simplification. If you say, like, when a user logs in, and that's a keyword, like it's called a keyword instead of a function, but somewhere down the line it still ties to a function. So I never really felt like I got simplification from it. And it's just like we're taking the code in the test, creating keywords so that we can put it in the YAML, but we're still just like coding it in the YAML effectively. It's just with fancier keywords instead of function names. What's the difference?
It feels like it's sort of a similar scenario though, right? Where I think like the hope and dream of typical behavior-driven development stuff is like you go get the business people who are super busy and off doing other things to like write in plain English what the business logic is supposed to be, and then you hand that to the developers, and the developers go and do it. And we have a similar situation, except instead of business people, it's people like Clayton who are super duper busy, and so we can't get a lot of their time, but we still want like some way to describe in human readable text like what the behaviors are, so that we can sort of agree like, yeah, that sort of seems like the right list of behaviors. And then we can have a whole bunch of other people go off and separately like write that the correct way.
You know what's interesting?
Analog, like standardizing the business language that the bottlenecked people can use.
Yeah. Maybe
there's not ambiguity.
So one of the fundamental premises of John's proposal, he tries to retrofit what we have today. Like we never, it's hard for me to say because I know fully well how much effort it would be. We've never actually said, like, in an ideal world, if we burned it all to the ground, what are the features and ideas that we would want to have, right? You know, we tried doing this early on, but like we were too busy building the system and, you know, like building the race car while driving it, that we never actually stopped to say like, okay, what is it that we really want from this apparatus? And we've tried several times and they've failed. I don't know if what we're doing right now is basically trying to say, in an ideal world, what is it that we really want? And if we're going to do that, I would say like we'd even take a step back further and say like, let's start speccing from a very high level. What are the features that we want? I don't know if that's a tenable even. I don't even know if that's a tenable thing to do because it's a mountain of work.
When you say features, are you talking about like the features of a great new testing framework that would solve all our problems?
Well, that would encompass these solutions, but also fix other problems we have. Like we don't actually have suites. Like we use tags as an overload for suites, right? Stuff like that.
We don't have structured metadata around the tests. We don't fit well into, you know, more broader types of like, I want to go run this. Like, I think actually a key thing, Tim, to bring up is when we started the EDE test suites, we were addressing it as an EDE test, our own cluster. And we had a little bit of behavior at that time, but we didn't have external client libraries. We didn't have a lot of the tools. And so it was always much more of a half integration, half EDE test. And I think some of those assumptions underpin like where we've gotten to with conformance is we did retroactively take EDE tests written in this fashion that are somewhat closely coupled. We don't have a lot of description about what the desired behavior is anywhere near the tests other than maybe in the code and some comments with them.
So I guess my question for the group would be, does it make more sense to bolt on more tooling to the current structure, or do we start from first principles and say, here are the ideal set of features we would want, and then work that way forwards and see where we are or what we could potentially farm out to do?
That just feels like blowing to me, I still feel like the pragmatic path forward is we're trying to enumerate our desired features in terms of specifying what we want the tests to be. And then, no poker face over here, Clayton. So like, I think it's more productive for us to specify our ideal for like, sorry, I'm using too many words, to specify like what the behaviors ought to be. And then second, look at awesome tooling that could consume that, or write some crappy tooling that could like tie that to retrofit onto our existing stuff or whatever. But I think if we try and reinvent the testing framework universe first, I feel like that will slow us down significantly.
Are we doing a good job of articulating concrete requirements that are feeding into some channel of people? Because that part of what Tim says, I agree with. Like, I struggle daily on dealing with EDE and trying to think about things that reduce complexity for execution and editors and humans and all that. I think this group has done a good job of articulating connection between the test code and what it actually is trying to do. So there are some small things. I mean, we're not going to stop asking people to write EDE tests in the next 6 months. So the problem's getting worse. I think maybe some of your concern, Aaron, is the busy beavers are moving in this direction, and we'll always need to put things underneath them that kind of steer them, no matter what ideal outcome we have is.
Like, don't get me wrong. I'm super okay with the concept of like somebody's going to go off and write a whole bunch of conformance tests or a whole bunch of tests that exercise behaviors we consider to be conformant, and it's not going to be using Ginkgo. It's going to be using some completely other different thing. But I just think that'll take some time to pay off and verify whether that experiment has worked.
I am, and looking at the way that the various testing frameworks are connected, I think if we spend a little bit of time exploring their low-level connectivity, I think we can combine the two approaches, finding one that uses this separated behavior and testing, and continue to use the existing ones, so that we don't lose momentum as we're trying this experiment.
Yeah, so it's hard for me because how do we make progress? Like, there's the pragmatist in me, and then there's the idealist in me, and those two people are like schizophrenia, right? So how do you reconcile that in a meaningful way? It's hard to push the ball forwards here.
I'd like to see what we have on the generation side. I know that Clayton was saying that the API, using the API machinery would be hard to change and to do modifications there for the auto generation. But if maybe we spend just a little bit of time exploring what we have that's lower hanging as far as what gets generated into the Open API spec, because there is the Open API v3, I think, that adds a few more things. And finding those hooks that would allow us to add this little bit of metadata, and how can we pick that up in the tool chain without, I'd love to maybe get a little more of explanation of what the difficulties are. And I know that it's really complex. API machinery is amazing, and I don't have the mind to grasp the specifics of it, but I would love to to hear what are the things that can be, as we're trying to define the space, I'm putting my hands over all the edges, and that's one thing I can't grasp, Clayton.
It's a deep conversation. I might say it's just not structured for someone to go. I don't think it hits the core audience, because a lot of this is like with clear language, and like I think this gets to what we've been saying, is with clear language and clear description makes it easier to understand what tests need to be written. Writing the tests is not a huge chunk of the problem. Organizing, tracking, and monitoring the set of tests we have and assessing where they are. I mean, like the generation stuff can help with a little bit of it, but I don't think it would. I think it's just, it's definitely a few steps below where maybe some of the things that you've been doing, and we've been looking at the behavioral system to see. I do really feel like one thing that kind of came up as we were saying this that we might want to hammer on is KEPs really should describe the behavior of the system. And if we're not actually getting good actionable behaviors on the existing core stuff, it's possible that like we actually, could spend a little bit of time maybe in SIG architecture and others or in this group, actually looking at what we can do to take the behaviors and get them into some documented forms, whether that's the conformance tests or any other spot. I do think we can encourage more of that to be done up front with new KEPs for sure. We're just like, I feel like we're still kind of, the only thing in this middle portion that's really going to attack it is writing a bunch of tests and having a good map. If we need to work on the map, possibly, relying on time from people, but we could focus on that too.
I really dig the idea of throwing the definitions into KEPs. I don't know if you've seen this, but when you throw code blocks into Markdown and you write the word feature, it color syntax highlights the feature sets in Gherkin. So we could theoretically go through, and we'd have to have a little more styling around it. Our style of test needs to say, given the starting points, blah, 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 this is what we're wanting it to do. And they don't have to understand the specifics, but when we're throwing it up to the KEP level and saying your KEP needs to describe the behavior, and then it won't be accepted until the tests are written that match, that literally they're matching that behavior pass, and that it's passed off by people who are experts in that area. It tends to, I don't know, it's something to think about. But I really dig having the definition of done in the KEP in a language that we use to verify it.
A question, if something like that were to be done, where would you draw the line though? Because them describe, like, let's say I'm making new feature foo, I'm describing its behavior, which is this big, but how much of that is or will be conformant, possible, capable? If it's an optional feature, then none of it's ever conformant. I don't know, where do we make that decision at then?
Yeah, I think the challenge with KEPs is it's the new edge, and we're still trying to cover the core. Anything we do, whether it's language or just in the KEPs saying like, here are the scenarios that are supposed to work in clear plain English, is kind of what the KEP is supposed to do. That might be something we can take over. It won't solve and address some of the fundamental problem here.
There's supposed to be something in there about a test plan.
And I've seen decent test plans, and I've seen people write decent tests. I do think, and I haven't looked at the core tests in a while. We actually have pretty good feature testing in general. I'm less worried about new features getting added these days than the middle ground before that came in early. And there's gaps, but like, it's a good, like, again, those tests need to be validated for conformance is probably sufficient in terms of the work that's already been happening there. It's the oldest and most entangled features that have some of the weakest tests, it seems.
So we spent a lot of time kind of circling the wagons around the broader topic of testing in general. How can we wrangle this into a set of finite action items that, besides like, burning the world and starting from scratch? What are some finite set of action items we could go forth? I think his specification requires a lot of extra data. And I know that if everyone else could take a read of that spec and maybe provide some useful feedback, but maybe in parallel, I think defining the requirements of an ideal world are not a bad thing to do either, right? If we actually started to write down what it is that we really want, and then maybe slowly over time we can mutate what we have into that state space. But we've never actually done that. Like in an ideal world, how would we do this? But ignore everything else that we currently have. Right? What would be the requirements? What would be the details? And then over time, we can map what we have and try to push it in that general direction.
Yeah, I don't think that that's an awful choice either, considering the fact that we only have about 200 conformance tests. That's not intractable. And then every existing test, even if we wanted to promote it to conformance and like tie it to some ID, there's still a manual human step. So we're kind of trading out, theoretically, possibly, moving code from one set of tests to another set or tying it with a code. I don't know, there's a step either way.
I feel like this overlaps a lot with the mandate of the testing commons subproject.
Kind of
has
Tim, is that?
similar staff.
I'd love to come to that one. It's at 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah, Tim's working on finding a new time for that, I think.
We're supposed to be a little bit. I'll send an email with the time change that people have requested. It's supposed to be on Mondays, I believe now.
Okay. But like my understanding is that group's focus at the moment is more on taking our existing E2E Ginkgo monstrosity and trying to untangle dependencies to make it easier to import elsewhere.
Yes. That's the primary goal right now, because if we're trying to do this federated repository business, which we've said, I don't know, what year is this? 2019? Did we start saying this in like 2016? I lost track. I think it was 2016. We were offsite and we were talking about this, and Daniel was prognosticating the future, and it died on the vine. But if we actually want to do this, we need to make sure that the libraries that we create are actually importable and don't drag in the entire universe of Kubernetes. And our end-to-end testing infrastructure requires us to import the world. And we've been breaking that apart slowly but surely. So that way, as we get like cloud provider integration, like CCM in particular, they want to be able to test their stuff using a lot of the good pieces that we have. I don't want to like totally crap on our testing framework. I want to basically say there are good pieces in there that are reusable, and they want to be able to use those good pieces in a meaningful way, so they don't have to reinvent the universe every time.
Tim, is that owned by Code Organization, do you think, or is this a joint thing between testing? Because that was one of the key goals for testing or for organization, but I haven't had a chance to push on it recently.
We've been underneath SIG testing forever, but I don't really care. I just want to make sure that we like try to push the ball forwards. I think we can own it. The problem is it's 90% part timers, right?
Yeah, it really, the review work and the agreement has been the hard part up till now. Somebody just needs to have the review time. That is a very good goal though, because that coupling is a painful coupling. So, yeah.
So it sounds like it is still worth investing significant effort in taking the thing that we have and making it better. Okay, yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is the group to dream big. It just seems like if we already have the staff part-time dedicated to like incrementally improving the existing thing, maybe that's the momentum inertia path for us. SIG testing is always happy to host anybody who is willing to create some magical new testing framework that solves all of our problems or refactors our existing testing framework stuff. Any and all are welcome.
A 10 million line PR that changes all the tests.
Hey, as long as they all pass, right?
Well, I don't think these things should be overinflated. I think describing in a document an ideal set of scenarios is a tenable thing that won't require you refactoring the universe, right? And seeing how that maps into John's proposal and how you can get a migration path eventually towards the state you want to be in, even if it takes a long time, I don't think is also an untenable thing. If people have the time to do it, me, I don't have time to do it. I just don't. Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like I just want to get our map of desired behaviors more than anything else. Like our tests are kind of not super easy to review either. So I would love something that makes them easier to write or easier to read or easier to write well. But that decouples for me. Is there anything else we should be talking about?
No, I think we've beat the dead horse 1,000 times. Does someone want to take an action item to potentially try to distill down this conversation, if it's even humanly possible, into some actionable feedback on John's proposal? I know that we already have some comments which overlap, but I do think that they're disaggregated, right?
I'm meeting with John for an hour tomorrow at 4 a.m. my time. So
Okay.
combining, I'll re-listen to this, take notes, and also combine my time with John tomorrow.
I think I will take a stab at trying to rally enough cats to document what are the ideal sets of features we would want if we could start from scratch. And I don't think I don't expect that to be done anytime soon, unless people actually show up and want to do this.
Similar sort of deal, but I'm trying to noodle on dropping the use of a text file and instead using a YAML file for our existing tooling to nudge us closer there. And when I have more of a cohesive idea, I'll drop that on that PR or open up an issue proposing what to do.
All right. Hopefully some of this was fruitful. Let's see if we can follow up on the action items and get moving. In the meantime, I may poke on the conformance channel in the next couple of weeks for people who are interested in helping to do reviews, so we can move some of these things through the chain in the meantime. So if you are able and willing, or if you work for VMware, I can volunteer you.
So a thing that I saw discussed sort of in the channel was the idea that there was this one test that was like written, had to do with limit ranges and flowed really well, but sort of the weird mechanics of how we require everything to be an it, and then how it's always create namespaces to be fully hermetic, made me question. So Clayton suggested what I think is a reasonably sane thing, which is we should probably like speed up namespace deletion and make that async anyway by default. But like, do we want to revisit whether it's possible to use other mechanisms to specify conformance it or conformance by whatever?
You can bypass creating a namespace as well, but these tests all kind of need one. It gets weird when you share them, and I feel like that's more complex. The interesting thing about the namespace one is most of the things those tests can get arbitrarily close to being instant. If we fix the async, it may just not be that bad. The thing about it is it's so deeply tied to framework for historical reasons. That kind of gets me into the, like, are there investments we can make? Like, I agree, Aaron, like, could we make an investment in a variant of it that feels more natural within the suite? Is there need some Ginkgo expertise?
Yeah, I can try noodling on that a little bit more, because I felt like it was a really well-written test. Like, it flowed pretty well. It sort of did set up and moved from one thing to the other, but it wasn't complicated. I felt like each step sort of verified stuff, and it kind of built on some of the things beforehand. And it did a pretty good description of what I would expect a limit range to do with pods. And to like break that up into a bunch of more hermetic things is, more noise and will take longer. And it wasn't clear to me what benefit there was to that.
I think that's just a framework wrapping problem. I think you could probably just have a second implementation that just doesn't do the namespace iteration. But they're also, like, to get back on my old horse from a long time ago, namespace deletions, the only reason they're still a problem is because that legacy code from etcd2 days, where we had the data model was strict hierarchy versus the way it is in etcd3.
Yeah. Well, the async protection really is just because we were really paranoid. I think we're at the point where if the API server accepts deletion and it doesn't, the cleanup at the end, like Ginkgo is really bad at this, but like I can go help drive this because this probably is the biggest performance win we can make in EDE suites today.
Yes.
It probably could reduce EDE time by a significant chunk. And so like just for that reason alone, doing the bare minimum, I'm happy to go like push on that. I should have done this before. And I'll bring other people in if necessary to get over the hump.
One other thing I feel like sort of updating on or just talking about with the time we have left was one of our P1s about sort of the master image list for the conformance tests. Thanks to Claudia and John, like I think we've consolidated a lot down to the AGN host image. I am currently incapable or do not have the sufficient things to like build and push the Windows variants of these images going forward. I think it would be useful to, there's some work out there to like have Cloud Build do some of this image pushing for us, which I would like to investigate using instead, so that we don't have to rely on Googlers pushing buttons, but rather like when a PR merges, the thing just automatically gets built and pushed. It would break things up into sort of a two-stage process where you push the PR that builds the image and then you open the PR that uses the image, but that's pretty close to what we have today anyway. Yeah, but I think like we're getting close there, and I wanted to confirm if other people feel like we're getting close.
Yeah, that's actually one of my action items for the testing commons as well, is just to reassess that ticket holistically and see where did we want to draw the finish line and how far away we are from there. Because I know Claudia has aggregate, I think like 12 of those images into a single, the AGN host. And I think for
20.
Say again? Oh, there you go.
Almost 20.
Almost 13. Okay, so do you know how many,
almost 20, sorry.
do you know how many of the conformance images, not like all the ETE images, but just the conformance tests, I think used 14 images. And I think you have consolidated, so.
In the issue you have opened, I've listed all that have been centralized image. In total, there should be almost 20. I don't know. Sorry?
I said, so you've about cut it in half.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, kind of. Not all of them are being used in conformance, but most of them, yes.
I will run, I had done some sort of alteration on the end-to-end suite so that I could track like which images the conformance test specifically used. I'll rerun that code and see how many images we're down to on that, because that was the one this group was concerned about reducing the most.
But yeah, I guess maybe the other reason I'm saying it out loud is just to point out what now seems obvious in retrospect, that like by pushing a whole bunch of programs into one image, it sort of bottlenecks us or serializes us on changes to that one image. So we really, I hope to see us get automated image building and pushing for this sooner rather than later. But yeah.
All right, we are at time. Hippie, when you go through to try and distill down this conversation, could you please put action items into the doc so to keep us honest? Then tag us, and then I can actually go back and address them. But we're at time, so we should call it.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Happy Tuesday.